I welcome you all to this webinar by W T S Dhruva Consultants on VAT and education. My name is Nimish Goyal. I'm a partner at W T S Dhruva Consultants. I'm sure all of you would agree that UAE as a country has taken every effort to make itself one of the largest and the most prominent education hubs of the world. Even in its agenda 2021, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed very clearly laid down that one of the key priorities of the country would be to create a competitive knowledge-based economy. And in that effort, the country has invited universities and schools from across the globe to invite them and have their campuses set up in the country, which has significantly attracted a large number of students, international students, to study a variety of courses. Now, while the ecosystem to promote UAE as an education hub is quite progressive, it is also important for these education bodies, schools and universities and colleges to understand the tax environment in the country. Globally, we all are aware that typically education is generally zero rated from a VAT perspective so that it becomes affordable for masses. And also it allows the education institutions to recover whatever input costs they incur. While the core education services are always subject to 0% VAT, it is the allied activities and services that are subject to challenge. And this is where the complexities around the whole education ecosystem for VAT arises. So some such services which typically are either supplied by the education bodies or are received by them could typically include transportation, food and beverage provided to students in the cafeterias, accommodation provided to faculty. So we have universities, large universities, which provide accommodation to the faculty. And whether those accommodation is a residential accommodation or a service accommodation, and each such transaction typically entails a different VAT treatment, and which could also potentially impact the recoverability of input VAT on such institutions. Similarly, with this COVID-19, universities have gone online. So, students could be sitting anywhere in the world, but the courses are being imparted from UAE. So, how do you tax such services? Similarly, extracurricular activities which are conducted by either schools or universities, which are for which there is separate charges recovered from students, could potentially have a different VAT treatment. Now, FTA also has been fairly active in educating the masses. We've had a couple of tax bulletins released. One was released for the preschools and the schools, and the other one was for the higher education sector. Now, though we have enough clarity from FTA, but there are still a lot of issues that are unanswered. And because the education system, the whole ecosystem is so large, we thought of conducting this webinar where we would like to discuss some of the most intricate issues that we have either seen or advised while we're dealing with some of the larger education bodies. And to discuss these issues, we have an excellent panel today. I don't think we could have agreed for a better panel. And we have the heads of tax of some of the largest and the most prominent educational institutions in the country. And if I can start to introduce them, first we have Ms. Heba Abu Rabia. Heba, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Heba currently is the Director of Financial Control and Operations at University of Sharjah. She represents the Emirate of Sharjah in this panel. She has been a CPA and has more than almost a decade of experience in accounting, finance, and tax. And she has been in the education industry for almost 6+ years, and she's currently heading the tax at University of Sharjah. Then we have Mr. Mohammed Amin. Mohammed, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you in this panel. Mohammed is also a qualified accountant, has had more than 15 years of experience in varied functions of finance and tax. He was instrumental in implementing VAT at NYU, and currently is the Associate Controller at New York University of Abu Dhabi. So Mohammed represents the Emirate of Abu Dhabi on the panel. Mohammed, thank you so much. And then we have Ms. Bhakti Thakkar. Bhakti, thank you so much for joining us. Bhakti represents the Emirate of Dubai. She currently heads taxation at GEMS education. GEMS, I'm sure all of us would know, is the largest K-12 education body of the country. She has been in the region for 6 years, managing the taxes for GEMS. And previous to joining GEMS, she was also working with some of the global consulting firms in the areas of mergers, acquisitions, and international tax. Bhakti, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Um, and then I have my colleague Deepak. Deepak is an associate partner at W T S Dhruva Consultants. And Deepak will be moderating the rest of the session along with the panelists. So thank you so much again, the panel, for joining us. And Deepak, over to you.
Thanks, Nimish. Thank you so much. Morning, everyone. Welcome again to the second webinar, which we are focusing on the education sector. And thank you so much, Amin, Heba, and Bhakti for joining us. Before we, start our webinar today, I thought it will be a good idea to just hear out a small story. I'm sure you would have heard of this. Some of you would have heard of this five blind men story. So these five blind men once visit a fair and hear some people shouting, "Elephant is here! Elephant is here!" However, these five blind men really do not know what's an elephant. So as soon as the elephant comes, each of them goes and touches a body part of the elephant. So the first guy goes and touches the ear of the elephant and says, "This is something like a fan." Another guy goes and touches the tusk and says, "This is quite smooth and it looks like a spear." The other guy goes and touches the trunk and says, "No, no, 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 this seems like a snake." The fourth guy touches the leg and says, "You guys are crazy, this is some kind of a pillar." The last guy touches the tail and says, "No, no, no, this is a rope." So the analogy that we are trying to draw here is, VAT or education sector from a VAT perspective is like an elephant. The largest schools, universities, institutions have been taking VAT positions depending on their organization structure, the way they have structured their transactions. The other part is around the education, regulatory authorities, the KHDA, the Abu Dhabi Education Councils, which have been, releasing various guidelines, not on VAT, but more from an education sector perspective. Now, when we started looking at education sector as such, in terms of looking at the compliances for various schools and universities, we were pleasantly surprised that the number of issues these schools and universities have, even in light of the fact that education sector per se is zero rated, but that was quite surprising for us. So the way we want to plan this now is we'll pick up 7 or 8 issues in the next 40 to 45 minutes. And possibly, I'm sure, again, going back to the point, the schools and the universities would have different tax positions on these. And I would not really comment on the correctness or the, incorrectness of those. I'm sure these will be right in their own wisdom. So the way, again, we've structured this is we'll initially talk about more from the school's perspective and then move on to higher education. Two things before we move on. The panelists, when they discuss or share their thoughts or views, are their own personal views and really may not necessarily represent the organizations that they come from. The second thing, I thought it will be interesting to take a poll here in terms of understanding what the audience believe out of these 8 areas are the the most complex from a VAT perspective. Could we have the poll, please? Right, we'll just wait for like 10-15 seconds. Perfect. Can we have the results, please? Right. So I am not really surprised from the fact that education trips and endowment grants, again, online education as well, find a mention in terms of the complexities. So thank you so much, audience, for this. If we move ahead in terms of the topics that we wish to discuss, the first one is around extracurricular activities. So I'm sure the audience would be aware in terms of schools and universities, the students are taken out for, they have these extracurricular activities which could be organized in the school or could be outside the school. These could be run before the start of the school or after the school. And this could range from anywhere from sports to cooking, to photography, to origami, to Zumba, etc. In fact, some 2-3 weeks back, my son said there's some kind of a Dragon Den business club activity in his school. So I was really intrigued by the number of activities that the school undertakes. So the point here is the students really are allowed to select 1 or 2 activities as free. However, there are certain activities which are chargeable as well. So, Bhakti, if I may invite you here and request you to share your thoughts in terms of how do these activities get taxed, or how do you report it from a VAT perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Deepak. So as far as extracurricular activities is concerned, it's a rather straightforward topic in my view, as per the law. But before I get into the VAT elements of it, let's just quickly do a recap of Article 40 of the Executive Regulations, because that is going to be one of the most crucial provision in the law that underpins education per se. What Article 40 provides for is certain conditions, let's say for zero rating of educational goods and services. But then it very clearly articulates 8 exceptions to this zero rating. One of the exceptions to zero rating is extracurricular activities or fees that are charged by schools for an additional amount over and above tuition. So, when we talk about all the examples that you basically just gave, on extracurricular, to the extent there is an additional fee that a school charges, in my view, this is very clear. It should be 5% standard rated. And, to the extent, of course, there's no additional fee, it very much is covered within the ambit of tuition. I think there's one interesting, so when we were doing this sort of internally, back in the day, there was one interesting example that came up, which is worthwhile discussing here. So, when we kind of talk about extracurricular, and even the examples that you gave, you typically discuss, sport or art or, something to do which is kind of outside of the core curriculum subjects. But I'd like to draw the attention that when we talk about extracurricular, there could be an extra math or a science class as well that a school may be providing, which is over and above tuition. Now, this could also be for an additional fee. And typically, what we've seen is there are 2 scenarios. One could be for just providing an additional sort of added learning support to certain students that we give these extra classes. But this is still very much to bring them up to speed, to the curriculum level. And therefore, my view would be that very much fits within education, core education per se, and be zero rated. But then on the other hand, if there is an extra math class we are providing to certain students who want to focus on STEM subjects, for let's say further getting into certain specific universities, and we're giving them extra coaching on it, that kind of is very clear outside of the education remit and outside the curriculum remit, and therefore we would 5 rate it.
So what I hear from you is if it's really related to the curriculum, you go by zero rating. But if it's something beyond your curriculum, ideally an extracurricular in terms of music, singing, dancing, etc. So that is where you could be potentially taxing them, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Just a follow-on question on this, while you were speaking, in terms of, if there is, let's say, a student who really needs to work on a particular subject and say a maths or a science, and the school offers to give him or her some additional classes and charges for that particular class. So would you look at it more from a curriculum perspective or additional charges by the school?
So yeah, clearly the distinction I was trying to make. So if it is what we call this is a learning support fee. So this is not wanting to get the student to a level that is over and above curriculum, or to create a niche or specialization of them on certain subjects. What you just discussed is to actually give an additional, so we do even one-on-one coaching for certain students wherever it's required, right? And to that extent, what my view would be on this topic is it is very much to reach the curriculum level. And that is why I would believe zero rating is more appropriate in this situation, and not otherwise where you do it for more specialization. So I would zero rate this.
Got it. Got it. Perfect. No, I think that makes sense. Maybe if we can move to the next topic, that's around application fees and registration deposits. Now, just for the the understanding of our audience, I'm sure people who have kids would be familiar with these words. Application fees is something that a parent pays when he or she wants to enroll their kid to a particular school, and this is a fees not so basically the school undertakes an assessment, and that's where the school charges this fees. The other bit is registration and re-registration deposits. This is something where the university or school has confirmed a seat to the student. However, the school requires the parent to deposit a particular amount which is non-refundable in most cases, and will be adjusted against the tuition fees. So Bhakti, if I may again, bring you in here in terms of, again, the taxability of the application and the registration fees, more specifically, considering the regulatory bodies, KHDA, the Abu Dhabi Education Council, these bodies have also been, I think, issuing guidances around application fees and registration, basically the application of these fees and deposits. So how would you look at it from a VAT perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Deepak. So as far as this topic again is concerned, this falls within one of the 8 exceptions, which I'd like to draw everyone's attention on. So once again, Article 40 of the Executive Regulations talks about zero rating, but one of the exceptions to this is that if there are any goods or services that are supplied to persons that are not yet enrolled in an educational institution, then those would be outside of the remit of zero rating. And so I think when we are discussing, application fee or such similar fees, I think the most important point here is to decide when is this fee being charged in the entire sort of enrollment process. If it is charged before enrollment, it's very clear that it has to be 5 rated. If it is charged after enrollment, then one can take a position that this is zero rated, of course, subject to the other zero rating conditions. And I do think, what you mentioned, Deepak, on the regulatory side of things as well, I think it's worthwhile discussing that for a minute. Mm-hmm. So back in 2018, when VAT was introduced in the UAE, schools across UAE, particularly in Dubai, were charging different types of fees for registration processes. So this could be, called admission fee, enrollment fee, assessment fee, entry fee, registration application, whatever the nomenclature may be. And therefore, there was a whole host of fees that one had to come across, right, to determine whether or not this fee is supposed to be 5 rated or 0 rated. But at least as far as Dubai is concerned, KHDA issued a policy in terms of the fee structure as far as the registration process is concerned. This was issued sometime last year in July. And so ever since, any Dubai school can only charge, the fees that, by the way, are on your slide right now. So what that means is an application fee up to 500 dirhams can be charged. And this is typically for processing all the new applications that a school would receive, and this, generally and typically what I've seen is definitely charged pre-enrollment, and therefore would take the color of 5% because it would fit within the exception to zero rating. But then when we talk about, on the other hand, registration deposit and re-registration deposits, they are very akin to an advanced tuition fee. They typically are also adjustable against tuition fees for the first term, and therefore they would take the color of tuition and would be zero rated. So overall, my point is, at least in Dubai, the entire sort of fee structure has been, quite normalized and has been streamlined. And so today we don't see a host of different fees that schools would be charging to students, as a part of the registration process in Dubai. In terms of other Emirates, just to kind of cover them off as well, what typically I've seen, be it ADEC for Abu Dhabi, SPIA for Sharjah, or MOE for the other Emirates, they typically have a framework in place where an application or a registration fee can be charged to students. But this is either charged upon enrollment or concurrent with the enrollment, and is always adjustable against tuition fee, and therefore I would zero rate that too.
Right. No, I think those are interesting comments, but I thought, I'll just maybe put you a difficult one. So what would happen if a student or a parent has paid the application fee and the registration fees, a registration deposit, and the student does not turn up for any particular reason? Although to my knowledge, these are non-refundable, but I'm sure from a regulatory perspective, there could be a different angle.
Yeah, no, again, a good question. So typically, if I'll talk about it one by one. So if it's an application fee that has been paid by a parent, irrespective of them, the student actually enrolling in the institution or not, it's not refundable, and therefore, I mean, it's not really linked to education or tuition per se. So the supply that is underlying in relation to that application fee is processing of that application, which is always done on the spot. And therefore, I would say that irrespective of the student joining the school for an application fee, we would not anyway refund it, and that characterization of VAT does not change. But it's slightly different because registration deposit, like I said, is nothing but an advanced tuition, right? So to say. What happens there is, firstly, the cases are very rare that a parent would have paid a registration deposit and then has decided of KHDA, this is actually a non-refundable deposit, right? So we are not obligated to refund this as a school. We definitely do consider refunds, etc. That's an operating matter. But as far as VAT is concerned, to the extent it is refunded, we are anyway reversing the zero rating, right? So it is fairly simple. But to the extent we decide to retain that deposit, because if it allows us from a regulatory point of view, and if we do retain that deposit, then I think there are two views on this, right? There is now no longer an underlying supply. So one can take a position that, yeah, I mean, at the time I received this deposit, it was supposed to be for education and hence was zero rated, and I will continue to zero rate it. That is one position. But the other position that I think businesses should also really consider is, do we want to now recharacterize this to an out of scope supply? Because this is no longer, there is no underlying education that is ever going to be provided to that particular child. And therefore, do we still keep it at zero rated? Well, we need to think about it. I would perhaps recharacterize it as out of scope.
100, I believe. Right. So thank you so much. I think we move to our next topic, which is around education trips. It's commonly said, learning, takes place everywhere, and I think that's where schools and universities have introduced these, trips. Could be educational trips, or could be recreational trips, could be part of the curriculum, could be within UAE, or could be international trips. Now, although in the backdrop of the entire education and VAT, education is zero rated, but I believe there could be certain challenges around categorizing these trips as whether, first of all, is it part of curriculum or is it recreational? So Bhakti, I'm sure you would have dealt with this issue at large, and so my question to you here would be, how do you decide, is it part of the curriculum, and who decides this?
Very interesting topic, Deepak. I cannot emphasize how much of a hot topic, if I may, right? This has been in the education sector for the last 2-3 years. Look, we've done extensive work on this internally, and personally, again, for me, the law actually is like the other two cases I said, right? The law was very clear. But in this particular matter, the law is more subjective, in its application. And I'll tell you why. Because the way the law is worded, field trips by default are supposed to be 5 rated, unless they meet two conditions. So the two conditions that need to be met are, one is that the field trip is directly linked to the curriculum, and two is that the field trip is not predominantly recreational. And given the way the law is worded, the burden of proof always is going to be on the taxpayer on how do you make sure that these two conditions are fulfilled. So I think the sort of most crucial element here is to kind of also understand what is the relevance of field trips in schooling per se, right? And I think you did touch upon this when you were introducing this topic. Is that, look, schools these days in particular are very much looking to provide a well-rounded, sort of learning experience to students. A lot of this takes place outside of the classroom. It gives students an opportunity to have practical aspects sort of viewed and felt, in person, rather than just sitting in the classroom and understanding theory. So field trips are becoming more and more important. Of course, COVID has come up with certain challenges as far as field trips is concerned, and therefore in COVID days we see this less and less. But in the larger scheme of things, field trips is here to stay and will only become more and more relevant in schooling, right, from an education point of view. So having said this, I think for organizations, my recommendation would be to ask this question: who is it that will decide on the zero rating, given that there are two conditions to be fulfilled? Is it the trip coordinator, who's typically a teacher, that would decide the zero rating on the trip? Is it supposed to be the finance team that raises the invoice that is supposed to decide the zero rating on the team, on the trip? Or is it ultimately the VAT specialists, internally, or it could be even an external, consultant if we don't have VAT specialists in-house that should decide this? And I strongly believe, after having dealt with this topic quite extensively, that when it comes to field trips, it is a very subjective matter, and therefore only VAT specialists should be making this decision. I think it's easier to fulfill the condition that it is if it is a school organizing a field trip, it is directly linked to the curriculum. The sort of gray area exists as to where do you draw the line as to what is recreational. I mean, the term has not been defined in the law, and therefore it leads to this sort of subjectivity around this matter. And it should the VAT rate should sit within the VAT specialist's remit, and nobody else really should be making the decision on this. Another point I'd like to cover here, Deepak, is okay. One thing is that, let's say if there is a trip for grade 8 that is being organized to one of the museums, right? The VAT specialists have decided that yes, we've looked at the purpose and the nature of the trip, and have established that it is directly linked to the curriculum, and it is not predominantly recreational, right? It's a trip to the museum, and therefore it should be zero rated. But I think the evaluation should not stop there, because ultimately, what do you document is important. And therefore, if 2 or 3 years down the line, if FTA was to come and ask on a specific trip as to why did you zero rate it, it is not just the decision making, but the documentation trail that will come very, very handy and important in future. And therefore, I strongly recommend that there are, for every single trip, there are certain forms that are maintained, sort of, capturing why it was zero rated if it was.
Right. No, I think that's a very interesting point in terms of documentation. I believe not just the education sector, but the taxpayers at large really need to focus on the documentation bit as well. I mean, if I may, just bring you in here in terms of understanding your experience, to look at international trips, again, both part of curriculum or recreational. How would you look at them?
Thank you, Deepak, for the opportunity. And I think I would echo the point here, which was made earlier. It would be very fair to say the field trips are taken with the aim of introducing the student to a much broader education setting, and it becomes challenging to characterize them as a non-recreational or recreational. And one should always ask what impacts, if any, would have on the academic program credits or even grades by not taking such field trips. An answer to this would be either yes as well as no, and this would determine whether they should be zero rated or standard rated. Such evaluation shall stay with VAT specialists rather than the end user, and I completely agree with Bhakti on that. An exception would be the international trips, since they all fall within the scope of the international transportation services. Those are obviously zero rated. The only caveat for me is that the institute shall be only recovering the cost of such trip. Anything on top of that would potentially be subject to the VAT at standard rate.
Yeah, I would agree with that in terms of the core international trip being zero rated, and if there's any kind of a fee that gets charged, should be standard rated. Heba, if I may, get your experience, I'm sure university has been organizing such trips, and I remember our discussion where, in some cases, the staff or the faculty was merely acting as a facilitator, and there was no money flowing to the university. So how do you look at those transactions?
Thank you very much, Deepak. So as my colleagues Bhakti and Amin rightfully said, that in most cases it's quite difficult to substantiate the direct link between the curriculum and the trips, and there is always, or most often, an element of recreation involved. So in my experience, we have to look at international and local trips separately. So for international tour charges, the VAT treatment actually depends on if we arrange the trips, the foreign trips for the students as a principal or agent. So if we're merely collecting the money for the trips and paying that to the travel agent on behalf of the student, you can treat that as a disbursement, which is outside the scope of VAT. But where we are arranging the trips as a principal, the VAT treatment depends on whether we actually give a markup to the students. Without the markup, the VAT treatment follows the treatment of main supply, which can be zero rated in the case of foreign trips and standard rated in the case of local trips. But where we add a markup to the student, then the entire trip has to be VATable and would be taxed at a 5% rate.
Right. No, I think all three of you have really done good justice to this topic in terms of bringing a lot of clarity. So with that, if I may move to the next issue, that's around discounts, scholarships, and financial aids. Again, discounts largely to do with the current situation, could be the number of siblings or a staff discount. Similarly, scholarships and financial aids, these are typically either borne by the institute, the school at university, or it could be funded a third party. So Bhakti, if I may, bring you in here in terms of understanding your experience, how would you look at reporting these from a VAT perspective? That's one part. And the other, how do you look at any kind of financial aid or scholarship provided by a third party?
Sure. Thanks again, Deepak. And I'd like to stress, this has been obviously a very, very relevant topic with the onset of COVID, in the last few months. So what I'd like to do is categorize the discounts, right? Let's put them into simple baskets. If it's a discount of, let's say, I'm just going to give a ballpark percentage there, 20, 30%, right? Depending on COVID or other circumstances, then what I'd like to categorize them as is an ordinary discount. And therefore, if, for example, if a tuition fee of 10,000 is the per annum tuition fee that would be charged to a student, let's assume a 30% discount on it, and therefore 3,000 would be the discount. The VAT would obviously remain at 0% for core tuition, but only will be charged on the net amount, which is the 7,000 in this case. But when we talk about, let's say, 100% discount, let's take an example of, some staff-related discounts that could be up to 100%. Now, in that cases, or even I would like to club the scholarships here that schools themselves provide, and it's not a third party, but if it's the school themselves kind of giving scholarships to its students. What typically happens in this case is there is a supply of educational services, but then there is no consideration linked to it, right? And therefore, this would be viewed, in my view, this would be viewed as a deemed supply. And what becomes very important here is, from a compliance point of view, issuing an invoice is really critical here. Because if that invoice is not issued, one can, one would then have to look at blocking the input, that relates to that type of supply. And therefore, I would stress that given its education and 0%, to the extent there are these 100% staff discounts, or to the extent scholarships are provided by the school itself, invoices should be issued just to make sure compliance is done right. On the other bits, where you said scholarships may be provided. So scholarships, could be provided by, external institutions. Yes, that happens. And again, here I'd like to kind of basket them into two separate categories. One would be that, let's say an institution says, okay, I want to give a scholarship to, let's say, it could be linked to a competition, for example, and say, okay, whichever one student or two, right, wins this competition, will get a scholarship for, the coming year. And if it's specific student linked, and if it's a specific amount of, whatever is the exact tuition fee for that student for the upcoming year, I would actually consider that to be zero rated, because for me, it's a zero rated supply ultimately. whether I'm charging the student or whether it's another institution that I'm ultimately charging. But then the other basket would be if there is a lump sum payment that an institution gives, saying here is 500,000 dirhams, and this is as financial aid, as you mentioned, or it's just a scholarship ad hoc. Utilize it for the students that you think are worthy. Now, to that, I would say that transaction per se is out of the scope of VAT because, well, technically that's just prize money or like an aid that we have received, and therefore that would sit outside of the it would be out of scope and would sit outside of the purview of VAT.
Right. No, I think again, one point that I draw from what you just mentioned is again around the documentation, and in the backdrop of what has been recently seen around penalties. If there's a missing document, we could look at penalties being issued by the FTA.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Bhakti. Moving to the next issue, that's around promotional events. So I'm sure people would be aware or would have been to some kind of an education fair or an education expo where schools, universities, come in and display their courses, disseminate the information they want in terms of what courses the university or the institution has to offer. So these are more on the fairs. There could be certain private events like a graduation ceremony with the universities or the schools could organize. And this could be either open to the general public or could be private events. Now, the issue that we wanted to discuss here was more from an input tax recovery, because I'm sure, again, the fact is pretty clear that schools, universities spend a lot of money in terms of, let's say, decorating the venue, arranging for food and drinks. There could be trophies, prizes, gifts, etc. So, we've been witnessing a lot of noise around such events. Especially more from an entertainment perspective. So, we thought it would be a good point to discuss, and maybe Amin, I think you've dealt with this issue at large. And what kind of thoughts would you share in terms of how do you categorize an event, and how do you look at the expenses that you've incurred from an input recovery perspective?
Sure. So thank you, Deepak. It's a very good point, I think, from a business perspective. And FTA has published a public clarification on the non-recoverable input tax on entertainment that includes promotion and also services. I think it provides clarity on what has been a very sort of complex issue for many industries since the VAT implementation. This clarification has drawn a distinction between the entertainment provided for business versus non-business purposes. It has further split into the VAT recovery treatment made available to the government entities and also the private organization, considering both external attendees and employees. I'll touch upon it very briefly at this point of time. Is input VAT incurred on expenses pertaining to the external attendees will be blocked in full recovery for private organizations. However, for the government entities, there are a few exceptions in case of meetings with the delegation from other countries or representative from other government entities, as long as the official business, it's an official business meeting. In case of the employees, the input tax incurred on entertainment will be non-recoverable unless there is an obligation upon the employer, or if they're provided to employees in order to allow them to perform their duty in the normal course of business. This same clarification further considers the input tax on simple entertainment provided in the normal course of a meeting, which you could potentially recover. I think it's very important for every organization to have to build their own VAT matrix or internal policy document drawn upon or developed upon the executive regulation, and any subsequent public clarification have come out since the implementation, and that determines the type or the nature of expenditure and associated treatment. If you're in any doubt, then it is always advisable to take prudent and risk-averse approach, considering obviously the penalties, which are quite stringent, and the way FTA is behaving lately when it comes to the VAT inspections.
Right. No, I think I couldn't have agreed more on this. I mean, I think this issue has been very, very, industry specific, very, event specific. So I agree with what you just said. And maybe Heba, if you can, I think we had discussed an event where it was actually open for public, but there were specific invites as well sent out to certain students. So would you think the recoverability would get impacted because of the nature of the event?
Sure, as yourself and Amin rightfully mentioned, the issue is obviously a lot more complex since educational institutions. I mean, when we do conduct these events, we have to analyze several factors. So things like the purpose of the event, the targeted audience, all of that determine whether or not the input tax can be recoverable. So in many events and conferences that the university conducts, it's mostly open to all students, prospective students, general public. So things like Open Day, Innovation Week, science and education exhibitions, and so forth. And obviously there are expenses relating to the setup of those events, things like banners, media, venue setup, gifts, food, all sorts of things that go into that. So where the events are open to the public and there's no targeted or specific group, those are regarded as promotional events to drive student recruitment and retention. And so input tax can be recovered on those. On the other hand, where an event or conference is by invitation or targeted to a specific audience, the input tax recovery depends on the participation fees and if those are charged to the attendees. So input tax is non-recoverable if the event is free for the attendees, since it's regarded as pure entertainment.
Got it. Got it. No, I think I agree with that. I mean, if I may just put you a tricky one, how would you look at a case where, let's say, you invited an alumni who's become a very big celebrity, who's a singer, and he performs, and you pay him a fees and he charges you a VAT? Would you? And obviously, this is a public event. So, would you look at recovering this input tax?
Good question, Deepak. I think the challenge would be in such a case is how do you attribute such celebrity performance to your main purpose, which is student recruitment in an education fair. There is certain criteria, certain factors which are involved or revolve around this whole sort of process that determines the VAT treatment. Now, purely from a higher education perspective, I feel the prudent approach would be to block any input VAT associated with the performance. Having said that, I would also suggest reaching out to FTA to obtain clarification if the input VAT is significant, since one could argue that such services shall fall under normal marketing expenditure for certain non-education industries. So the VAT treatment may fall different. So it's always prudent to kind of reach out to FTA and get sort of a clarification in that respect.
No, I think the one thing I would take away from this slide is this topic is very complex, and it really makes sense to approach the FTA to ensure that you correctly claim the input tax. Thank you so much, Amit. Moving to the next topic, it's around online education. This is one of the topic which was highlighted as quite complex. Yes, I agree, it's quite complex. So, it becomes more important in light of the current situation we have, where schools and universities have picked up online education. There have been platforms which have got introduced in terms of educating the students. And again, from an FTA perspective, also, I think somewhere in August there was a guide issued, especially for e-commerce, and they did talk about electronic services. Again, just to set the context right for our audience, electronic services from a UAE VAT law perspective is something very specific defined in the law, and it has to be delivered over an electronic platform, could be an internet, right? That's one bit. The second bit is place of supply, which again becomes important. So for electronic services, the law says you need to look at the use and enjoyment of the service. So from a UAE law perspective, if the use and enjoyment is happening in UAE, then it is going to attract a 5% VAT. But if it's outside UAE, then the treatment could be different. Now, again, from a place of supply perspective, what we've seen is ideally you need to look at the place of delivery. Where are you delivering these services? So it could be a physical address. If not, if it's delivered to a particular device, you need to look at it, etc. So things really get complex when it needs to be determined, when you need to determine the place of supply. So, I think we can discuss two issues here. One is around electronically delivered services without human intervention or minimal human intervention. And the other could be around deciding or figuring out what is the place of supply, right? So Bhakti, if I may, I've seen this happening across schools and universities. How do you look at defining what is human intervention?
Deepak, thank you once again. And before I get into your pointed question, I think, first of all, this topic obviously is very relevant, in schooling per se, because when we talk about K to 12 schools, typically we've always kind of seen that, it's in classroom physical training. So yes, we see in higher education that the digital platform is used a lot more with or without COVID, right? But when it comes to schooling, this has been obviously a very unique shift for us. And I'm sure for most other schools across the world, not just in UAE. But I think, before we get into, and therefore, by the way, this topic was very close to my heart. And there's a lot of extensive, study done on whether, how do you treat this with or without human intervention? I'll come to it in a minute. But I would rather take a step back. And then I would firstly decide that we will look at the medium of delivery and we will look at whether or not there is human intervention or whether these are pre-recorded sessions. But first, I want to take a step back and see what is being delivered. Because if the underlying supply is still core education and it is the curriculum that we would have delivered in school, but is having to be delivered in, via a different format, does it really change the nature of supply, which is still core education? Well, my view on this is it would not. So for me, I would in fact take a step back and say, is this still core curriculum linked tuition, services that I'm providing as a school? If the answer is yes, then it is rather straightforward for me after having done all of the study. But if it is not linked to the core curriculum, and if there is, let's say, like we discussed, these extracurricular activities, right? And it could be via online platforms very much. So let's say an extra math or a science class, as we discussed in the extracurricular point a few minutes ago. If that is today now being delivered online, yes, I definitely then want to see whether there is human intervention or whether this is pre-recorded. By human intervention, to answer your question, it would mean if there is a live classroom session, let's say on a Zoom session like this that is taking place, where a teacher is sitting on the other side of the screen and doing a live session, versus if there is a different style of delivery where you have pre-recorded sessions or more online assessments or for self-study of students. That would, in my view, be considered as an online, let's say, service or delivery without or with minimal human intervention. As per the law, if it is, a pre-recorded session, and if it is a service without human intervention delivered online, then that would be considered as an electronic service. Then we get into the whole, where is this service being enjoyed? Where's the use and benefit of it, basically? And then we get into the e-commerce guide, which the FTA has published and is extraordinarily useful. But then if there is human intervention, you'd still typically want to then see what is the underlying supply. It would fall outside of the remit of electronic services. In this case, because it's still extracurricular, right, the math or the science lesson, over and above education charged for an additional fee, let's say, it would be 5% in my view. So I would go back and link the supply to what is the core nature of supply, and then determine the.
Yeah, I think that really makes sense. So you need to actually look at what's the original supply, and really the medium of supply would become secondary. And again, as you rightly pointed out, obviously if it's outside the curriculum, then this particular aspects becomes important. But I think we had a discussion around this where, from a higher education university's perspective, we did see, especially in the last 6 to 9 months, students had to travel outside and they took courses from there, online courses. So did you face any challenge around, categorizing these from a VAT perspective?
Yes, thank you very much, Deepak. What we've seen is that the FTA and the authorities in Saudi have already given us some guidance on certain things and parameters that we need to consider, things like IP address, the country code of the SIM card, and the place of residence. Now, in our case and the case of a lot of similar schools and universities, we don't have the technical equipment that allows us to get such information, such as the IP address and whatnot. So since all the information is not available and will not be available, we consider the place of residence or billing address as a local address for the student to identify the place of supply, since a lot of the online education classes were made mandatory because of COVID-19.
I think those are interesting thoughts. Yeah, maybe if we can move to the next topic. Yeah, I think this was the one complex topic, and let me tell you, when we started discussing internally with the panelists as well in terms of this issue, we really took at least an hour to discuss this issue. So I'm sure this will be an interesting discussion. So just to set the context here, I'm sure some of you would be aware universities and institutions, higher education especially, receive these endowment grants, donations, sponsorships. Now, grants are usually where you receive money and you need to put it to some specific use, could be research or could be for construction of a building. So, the question arises here is twofold. One is actually the taxability of such receipts and what happens to the input tax recovery. So, I mean, if I may, request you to share your thoughts in terms of how do you look at the taxability of these receipts, the grants and the endowments that an institution would receive.
Sure. Thanks again, Deepak. And I think if I remember rightly, the polling question was, I think there was a very heavy vote given to this point of endowment grants and donation. I think 40-odd%. And I say the focus is too much around this topic because that's core to, especially from an education perspective. So the law is very clear. I think we just have to go back to the basics all the time. And the basics is what the law or the executive regulation or any sort of public clarification say in that respect. The VAT treatment of donations, grants, and sponsorship depends on whether the donor, grantor, or sponsor, whatever the case may be, have received any benefit in return for such payment. Where any benefit is received or established in return for the payment, VAT implication will arise. If the grant is made without any express or implied benefit, it is obviously outside the scope of VAT. Now, the only drawback in such case would be that one would not be in a position to claim the input VAT, which are directly related to the payment of such grant in that respect. I will again refer this to your internal VAT sort of matrix, which everyone should create, that determines the types or the nature of receipt and sort of appropriate treatment. Now, the complication where it would arise if there are any specific deliverables being made part of such grant agreement. Is there any transfer of intellectual property? Is there any limitation on the spend? Or is there any sort of milestone or deliverable which are sort of embedded within your grant agreement? Because all such factors would potentially make it look like you're providing a service for a consideration, and then this will be subject to a standard rate VAT. Though you'll be in a better position because now you can recover any input VAT linked to your expenses on that grant. If you're unsure, again, always reach out to FTA, obtain clarification, and be mindful of all those sort of penalties linked to any wrong treatment which which FTA may pursue.
Yes, I agree. In fact, so if I remember to summarize it, this is you need to look at, is there any benefit, identify benefit which has value and a direct value for the grant, then potentially the taxability needs to be looked at. Heba, I'm sure, from your perspective, you've seen this issue in and out, more to understand what could be the challenges around the input tax recovery, both for the expenses that are incurred for generating these grants and the use of such grants.
Right, thank you, Deepak. So some of the expenses that we do incur to generate grant income are things like advertisement, lawyers' fees. Sometimes there are charity events that are conducted. So as per the law, the input tax can only be claimed if the expenses are incurred towards a taxable supply. So for each grant or sponsorship proposal, we should analyze them on a case-by-case basis. So if the expenses are incurred for earning such income can be claimed or not will depend on that proposal. So expenses incurred towards obtaining a donation income or not-for-profit grant is outside the scope of VAT. Input tax cannot be recovered. Whereas where expenses are incurred toward obtaining a commercial research grant or a scholarship, the input VAT, in that case is recoverable.
Got it. That makes sense. So, I mean, if I may, just get you again into a bit of spot. If you received some grant for construction of a building and donor says you need to put up my name on the building, how would you look at it from an input tax or a taxability perspective?
A good question, I think. You always remember when it comes to the indirect tax or the VAT, the output VAT essentially pave out the way for any recovery of your input VAT. Now, in this case, because the donor obviously has given you funds to build or construct a building and then put their name on, it will fall not in a grant sort of bracket, it falls in a sponsorship sort of bracket. So there are two things. First of all, it becomes in a sponsorship because there is a benefit. There is a very tangible benefit going back to the sponsor or donor. So the output VAT, it will be subject to the output VAT. Now, the other benefit, as I said earlier, is it will allow an organization to recover the input VAT in full in constructing or the cost involved in constructing that building. So it's a benefit for you as well in return.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much. If you may move to the last topic around accommodation, maybe we are just reaching our time to quickly, understand. So I'm sure the universities and this typically higher education universities and institutions give accommodation to the students in the form of dorms or their staffs as well. Two things, two questions. One around where the staff has been given an HRA and the HRA gets offset against such accommodation, and the other is certain ancillary supplies being provided, and whether this accommodation, which was earlier residential, gets converted to a serviced apartment, what happens to the taxability? So Heba, if I may quickly ask you in terms of the HRA being offset against the accommodation provided, how would you look at it from a taxability perspective?
Thank you, Deepak. So as always, there are things to consider. Again, the question we need to think about is whether the unpaid HRA is a consideration or not. So the real estate guide issued by the FTA stated that the provision of accommodation in lieu of payment of a housing allowance to the employee is a consideration. Alternatively, you can also say that the HRA is just part of the compensation towards salary. So it should not be taken as consideration towards a supply. So I think usually approaching the FTA with gray areas such as these can be considered the right decision to take.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, I mean, would you see any challenge in terms of the classification, especially considering the fact that residential accommodation are exempt except for the first supply and serviced apartment of 5%? Would there be a challenge in terms of classification?
Yes, there could be. And I think this is where the concept of single or composite supply could potentially arise. In other words, one supply with multiple elements. Now, to break it down very briefly, is residential accommodation with no additional services or only services which are incidental to the supply would be exempt for the VAT. That could be cleaning or garbage collection, etc. But service accommodation with additional services over and above your normal accommodation itself will be standard rated for VAT. And this is where you have to kind of create that distinction. The FTA did publish public clarification, that makes it clear. And they have put one sort of criterion that the FTA will consider, which obviously they'll consider to be crucial, is that a single composite supply must have all components supplied by a single supplier. If the components come from a multiple supplier, it will not be treated as a single component supply. Rather, the tax treatment for each component must be individually evaluated. So there are different sort of conditions which have to met in order to determine the tax treatment and to even split that into a residential or a commercial service accommodation.
I agree with that. Thank you so much. I mean, I think that brings us to the end of my discussion Thank you so much, Heba, Amin, and Bhakti. Nimesh, over to you.
Thank you, Deepak. Deepak, I must tell you that it was quite an insightful session. I think the topics that we picked up are really the burning issues which are being faced by the educational organizations, including the schools and the universities. And Heba, Amin, and Bhakti, thank you so very much for giving your views and sharing your experiences. Deepak, it might just be a good idea to have that poll which you conducted in the beginning to have it again and see if there is any change in the view of the audience. It might just be also helpful to understand how effective were the panelists on explaining the issues.
Yeah,
So can we have the poll again, please?
sure. Can we have the results, please?
Okay, so we had
Nimesh, I see the elephant in the room.
So yeah, so accommodation was actually just 4%, Deepak, which is now increased to 25%. Endowment seems to have gone down. I think Amin and Heba did a good job on explaining, the tax treatment of endowments. So that has gone down. But it's good. I think education trips still continue to be one of the prominent issues for consideration. So with this, I would just like to thank the audience for being a wonderful audience, attending this webinar. Thank you so much. And again, thank you to Heba, Amin, and Bhakti for sparing time and sharing your views. You have been very, very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much. And we'll just end the webinar now. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.